Old Ground Chapter 1. Renee Colter set the casserole dish down hard enough to make the table jump, which was on purpose, because Wyatt was 14 minutes late calling, and Eli hadn't looked up from his cereal bowl in 10 minutes, and somebody in this family needed to make some noise. She was still in her scrub top from that morning's shift, dark hair coming loose from the practical knot she wore for 12-hour days, and she moved through a kitchen like she'd been issued a couple extra elbows for the purpose. "If your brother doesn't call in the next 5 minutes," she said, "I'm telling the dorm's front desk there's a family emergency." "There isn't one," Josie said, not looking up either. She had a magazine open against the milk jug, folded back on itself, some article about barrel racing circuits 2 states over. "There will be. I'll invent one. I'm very creative." Renee pointed her serving spoon at Ren. "Your father thinks I'm not creative." "I never said that," Wade said from the doorway, still in his boots. He filled most of it without trying to, a big man gone sun-browned from 30 years outside, his father's same rangy build carrying a little more weight through the shoulders now than it used to. "You implied it, with your face. My face doesn't imply things. Your face is the most opinionated part of you." Renee was already laughing at her own joke before she finished it, which was, Wade had decided years ago, the actual charm of the thing. Not that she was funny, though she was, but that she found herself so reliably funny that it became funny on its own. Faye came in through the mudroom with a basket of green beans still warm from the garden, soft around the middle and silver-haired, 70 years more interested in feeding people than in being looked at. Behind her came Earl, wiping his boots on the mat with the same 3 careful strokes he always used. The same 3 strokes he'd probably used since before Wade was born, lean where his son was broad, weathered down to almost nothing but line and bone. He looked, most days, like he'd been carved out of the same fence posts he still set himself. "Fence on the east line's holding," Earl said, to no one in particular, which was how Earl reported most things, not as news, just as fact set down in the room for whoever wanted it. "Good," Wade said. Eli's tablet buzzed against the table, and he startled like he'd forgotten it could do that. Though everyone at the table knew exactly why he was on edge about it. He had a camera 3/4 of a mile out on the fence line, motion-triggered, batteries always dying at the worst times, syncing back to the house whenever he checked it on the kitchen Wi-Fi, since a cell signal wasn't worth counting on out here. And he checked it about as often as other kids checked social media. "Anything?" Ren asked, not really asking her, not expecting much of an answer either. She was 14 and had learned that the correct amount of interest to show her little brother's hobby was just enough to keep him talking and not so much that he'd explain the settings again. "Raccoon," Eli said, disappointed. "Better than nothing." Barely. The dinner went on the way most of their dinners went, which was loudly, and it was another 6 minutes before Wyatt finally called, and Renee answered on speaker and held the phone up like a trophy, and for a while the kitchen was just noise. Good noise. 5 people and a phone talking over each other, Earl eating quietly at the end of the table, a small, private smile tucked into one corner of his mouth, eyes tracking the noise around him without him ever needing to add to it. "Tell your grandma I said hi," Wyatt said near the end of the call, and Faye leaned in toward the phone without getting up, calling back. "Hi, sweetheart. Eat something green," which was what she said to all of them, always, regardless of context, and which had become such a fixture of this family's phone calls that Wyatt answered, "Yes, ma'am," without even needing to think about what she'd said. The ranch sat in a long, shallow valley at the foot of country that turned to real mountains a few miles further west, the kind of high, dry rangeland that grew good grass in a wet year and turned to paper in a dry one. The house itself sat roughly in the middle of it all, white clapboard gone the color of old bone, with the near pasture running right up to the kitchen window and the barn a short walk off to the east. The south pasture, bigger and rougher, took up most of the ground between the house and the county road. The backfield sat apart from all of it, past its own gate at the northwest corner of the property, screened off by a stand of old cottonwoods that had grown up thick enough over the decades to hide it from the house entirely, unless you knew to go looking. The Whitfield place bordered them to the north, separated by nothing more official than a tree line and a single strand of sagging wire that had marked the property line since before either family could say for certain who'd put it up. Cell signal out here was a rumor more than a service. One bar if you stood in the right spot on the porch and held your phone up like an offering, nothing at all past the barn. The house still ran on the same landline it had run on for 40 years, an old corded set in the kitchen and a cordless handset that never held its charge, and everyone had long since stopped thinking of that as old-fashioned. It was just how you called somebody out here, same as it had always been. Renee's shift the next day ran a full hour past when it should have, exactly like it always did on the days she'd promised herself she'd be home early. And by the time she got to the nurse's station to sign out, her feet had that specific hollow ache that meant she'd been on them since 6. A 7-year-old in Bay 4 had drawn her a get-well card that afternoon. Meant, as it turned out for the nurse on the shift before hers, a mix-up nobody bothered correcting because the kid had been so proud of the son he'd drawn, lopsided and enormous, taking up most of the page. "You're keeping that," said Denise at the next station over, not really asking. "Obviously I'm keeping it." Renee held it up to the light like it was a diagnostic image. "Look at this son. This son has ambition. You say that about every drawing." "Every drawing deserves it." She tucked the card into her bag, careful not to bend the corner, much like the 400 other kids' drawings she'd tucked away over the years, half of them now taped somewhere in a house an hour's drive from here, on a ranch that 4 kids of her own were, at that exact moment, probably making entirely too much noise in. She drove home with the radio up and the windows down, the ordinary tiredness of an ordinary day sitting easy on her the whole way. Faye had a rule, unspoken and unbroken as far back as any of the grandkids could remember, and never once written down anywhere, that whoever was smallest got to help her in the kitchen on baking days, which meant it had been Eli's job for the last several years, and would, before too much longer, belong to nobody, since there wasn't another Colter grandchild coming up behind him. "You're going to be too big for this before I'm ready," she told him once, flooring the counter, and he'd rolled his eyes at it, the specific performance of a 13-year-old secretly fine with the whole thing. She talked while they worked, not about anything in particular. Who'd said what at church, whether the tomatoes were coming in early this year, a story about Wade at 9 years old that she'd probably told 40 times and would tell 40 more. Eli mostly listened, hands sticky with dough, and it was, though neither of them would have called it this, one of the steadiest hours either of them had in a week that otherwise ran fast and loud and full of everyone else's noise. "You're quiet today," she said, one of these afternoons, not pushing, just noticing, just thinking. "About your cameras? Kind of." She didn't ask him to say more than that, because she'd learned, raising one son and helping raise 4 grandchildren, that the quiet ones told you things on their own schedule, not yours, and pushing rarely got you there any faster. Josie's whole week, most weeks, built towards Saturday morning, when she had the near arena to herself before the heat came up and could run patterns with the mare she'd been training since the mare was 2. Dark hair always came loose from her braid by the second barrel. She'd grown up tall and broad through the shoulders, built like her father in a way that used to bother her at 14 and didn't anymore. She wasn't good yet, not the kind of good that circuits paid attention to, but she was good in the way that mattered to a 17-year-old. Good enough to feel it in her hands when a turn went right. Good enough that the difference between a clean run and a sloppy one lived somewhere in her body now instead of in her head. The mare's name was Ranger, though Josie had started calling her Ranny somewhere around year 1, and it had stuck for good, and there wasn't a version of Josie's future, as far as Josie herself could see it, that didn't have this particular horse somewhere in the middle of it. Wade watched her from the fence some Saturdays, not saying much, because there wasn't much a father needed to say to a daughter who already knew exactly what she was doing wrong before he could point it out. "Tighter on the second barrel," he said anyway, because it was tradition by now, not correction. "I know, Dad. I know you know." She grinned at him going past, dust kicking up gold in the early light, and for a second the whole ranch looked like nothing more complicated than what it had always been. Eli's routine hadn't changed in 8 months. Check the camera on the north fence Monday and Thursday, swap batteries every other Sunday, catalog anything interesting in a note on his tablet that nobody else had ever asked to see. Mostly it was deer. Once, memorably, a bobcat, which had gotten him a full 10 minutes of Wade's genuine attention at breakfast, the first time Eli could remember his hobby earning that. He'd sat so still and quiet through the whole retelling that Renee had to elbow him to keep talking, small for 13 still, built more like a kid 2 grades behind him, the kind of watchful most people just read as shy. He liked the ranch at the hours nobody else paid attention to it. Early enough that the light hadn't decided what color it wanted to be yet. Quiet in a way the daytime ranch never got quiet, just him and whatever the camera had caught while everyone else slept. Josie found him kneeling by the fence post one Saturday, jaw tight, swearing quietly at a battery compartment that wouldn't seat right no matter which way he turned it, and dropped down into the dirt next to him without being asked. "Let me see it." "I've got it." He didn't look up, thumb jammed hard against the latch, like force alone might fix it. "You very clearly do not have it." She took the camera out of his hands before he could argue, turned it over twice, and popped the compartment open with one decisive twist, the battery sliding home with a click. "You're overthinking it, like always." "I'm not overthinking a battery. You overthink everything. It's kind of your whole thing." She handed it back and pushed herself up off the ground, brushing the dirt off the back of her jeans, already moving on to whatever she'd actually come out here to do. "It's a good thing, mostly. Don't let it go to your head." Eli turned the camera over in his hands once, found the compartment shut clean and solid, and didn't say anything, but he was still half smiling at it by the time she was out of sight. He didn't think of himself as watching for anything in particular. He just liked knowing what was out there when nobody was looking. Chapter 2 Sundays, when nothing urgent needed doing, tended to run slow and loose in a way the rest of the week never got to. No schedule holding any of them to anything. Wade would be out checking fence more out of habit than necessity. Earl would sit on the porch with the radio on low, some AM station that mostly played static with occasional bursts of a ballgame in it. Faye baked, always, whether or not anyone had asked her to, because a kitchen that wasn't making anything felt wrong to her in a way she'd never bothered explaining to anyone. Renee treated Sundays like a personal holiday, even though nothing about her actual schedule changed, declaring loudly, most weeks, that she was off duty as an adult for the day, which mostly meant she let Eli win at cards and made pancakes shaped like animals that resembled the animals only in the sense that both had 4 legs. "That's not a horse," Josie said of one particularly abstract pancake. "That's a rectangle with opinions. It's modern art, Josephine. Don't call me Josephine. It's your name. It's not my vibe." "For the record," Wren said without looking up from her camera, "I'd eat the rectangle." "Thank you, Wren." Renee set the plate down with real ceremony. "Someone in this family has taste. I didn't say it was good, I said I'd eat it." Wren photographed the pancake before anyone could eat it, for reasons she didn't fully explain and nobody fully asked about, and Eli spent most of the afternoon out at the fence line anyway, Sunday or not, because a hobby wasn't really a hobby if you only did it on the days that were convenient. The drought had been going on long enough that people had stopped calling it a drought and started calling it the year, like you'd name a hurricane, except slower and with no water in it at all. Wade stood at the top of the south pasture with his hat off, wiping his forehead with his forearm, looking at grass that had gone the color of a paper bag. "We've got maybe 2 weeks in this field," he said. Earl was beside him, not looking at the grass so much as looking at the horizon, like it owed him an explanation it wasn't giving. "Backfield's still green," Earl said. Wade looked at him. "The old field? We haven't run stock through there in, I don't even know, long as I can remember." "Longer than that." Earl said it easily, no weight on it. "We never used that field, you know. Not since I was a boy." "Why not?" Earl was quiet a second. the particular quiet of a man searching a drawer he hadn't opened in decades and not finding much in it. "Don't rightly recall," he said. "Just always been the one we didn't use." Wade looked back out at the dying grass, did the math on hay prices, did the math on what a herd looked like in 6 weeks if nothing changed, and opened the gate. Earl helped him walk the fence line that afternoon, checking for weak spots before they moved anyone through, the two of them working in the easy, wordless coordination of people who'd done 1,000 chores together and no longer needed to narrate any of them. "Your grandfather ever say why he shut this one off?" Wade asked, mostly to fill the quiet. "If he did, I don't remember it," Earl said. "Wasn't the kind of thing he explained. Just the kind of thing you didn't argue with him about." Wade let that sit, checked the next post, and didn't push further, because that was more or less how every conversation about the old man had gone his whole life. A few words, then Earl's attention sliding back to the fence line like the subject had never come up at all, and nobody in this family in the habit of pulling it back once it had gone. Faye watched him do it from the porch, a dish towel still in her hands, and didn't say anything either. She'd have told you, if you'd asked her that afternoon, that she felt nothing beyond the ordinary relief of a herd that wouldn't go hungry. That was true, as far as it went. It just didn't go very far. For a week or two after the gate opened, everyone on the ranch could feel the relief of it without quite naming what the relief was for. The herd out on real grass again, bellies filling out, the low daily hum of worry about hay prices and dying pasture gone quiet for the first time in a month. Renee remarked on it at dinner, lightly, same as she'd remark on good weather. "They seem happy," she said, watching a few of them through the window, grazing easy in the low evening light. "Whatever you did, Wade, it worked." "Wasn't much of a choice," Wade said, but he stood there a minute longer than the job called for afterward, hands braced on his hips, just watching the herd move through the open gate. The change, when it came the way most real changes do. Not as an event, but as an accumulation so slow that no single day of it would have qualified as a story if you'd tried to tell it to someone. It started as Josie mentioned it once at dinner, almost as praise. "They've been so calm lately, even the young ones." "Maybe the drought's got them worn down," Wade said, and nobody thought about it again, because that was a perfectly reasonable thing for a father to say, and a perfectly reasonable thing for everyone else to accept. It continued as something Eli noticed on his camera feed a few weeks later. Not anything dramatic, just 5-6 horses standing with their heads up at the same angle, facing the same direction, for longer than made sense for grazing animals watching for nothing. He showed Wren the photo on his tablet. "They're probably just watching a coyote, maybe," Wren said, already scrolling to her own camera roll, already thinking about the light on the fence post she'd been trying to catch all week for her project. "Yeah," Eli said, "probably." He didn't delete the photo. He wasn't sure why. It happened once with the whole family watching, though none of them would have called it watching at the time. They were out on the porch after dinner, the ordinary end-of-day drift of people not quite ready to go back inside, when Josie said, "Look," and pointed, and for a moment everyone's eyes followed hers to the near pasture, where a dozen horses had stopped mid-graze at exactly the same instant. Heads up, all of them turned toward the same empty stretch of horizon. "Huh," Wade said. "Weird," said Renee. "Coyote," Earl offered, though there was nothing visible out there for a coyote to be, and after a few seconds the horses put their heads back down, one by one, and went back to grazing like the whole thing had never occurred, and the family went back to their porch, and nobody mentioned it again that night. It kept happening, in small ways, across the following weeks. Wade noticed, checking the herd one evening with a mental clock he didn't know he was keeping, that the same handful of horses had their heads up at nearly the same hour 3 days running. Not the hour the sun set, not the hour anything obvious happened, just a time that seemed to matter to them for reasons Wade couldn't guess at. He mentioned it to Renee that night, lightly, like some odd habit of the neighbor's dog. "Probably just picked up on your schedule," she said, not looking up from the crossword. "Horses aren't stupid." "No," Wade agreed. "They're not." He said it easy, like the end of an ordinary observation, and went back to his crossword clue. And if some small part of him filed the moment away next to the trough and the gate latches and the two long stairs, he didn't let it show on his face, not even to the one person in this house who'd have caught it if he had. It continued further when Josie, mucking a stall on a Saturday morning, noticed that two of the geldings had somehow gotten the second latch on the north gate undone. Not broken, not forced, just undone, like a person undoes it, while the third horse in that section stood a good distance off, grazing, not involved at all, like it had better things to do. "Weird," she said to her father, who was checking a water line 20 feet away. "Latch is probably wearing out," Wade said. "I'll look at it." He looked at it. It was fine. Earl's own days ran to a rhythm nobody had to ask him to keep, up before anyone else, coffee standing at the counter rather than sitting, out to check the water lines and the fence and whatever needed fixing before breakfast was even properly on the table. He didn't talk much about any of it. He just did it. The same work in more or less the same order, day after day, the kind of quiet competence that had held this ranch together through droughts worse than this one, and would, he figured, hold it together through whatever this was, too. Faye came down some mornings before he'd finished that first cup, not because she needed to be up yet, but because 50 years of marriage had worn a groove into her mornings, too. She'd stand next to him at the counter in her robe, the kitchen still gray with early light, her hand resting light on his back while he read yesterday's paper a day late, and he'd lean into that hand just slightly, an inch, nothing anyone watching would have caught, the same way he'd been leaning into it for 50 years. "Anything good in there?" she asked, most mornings, already knowing the answer. Same as always. He'd fold the paper over anyway and hand her the crossword page, his fingers brushing hers in the handoff, a small ritual by now, because she liked doing it, and he liked watching her do it. And neither of them said another word until the rest of the house started waking up around them. He noticed the gate business himself a few days after Josie mentioned it, though he didn't call it anything in particular in his own head, just filed it away with everything else he'd learned not to make a fuss over, next to a long list of small oddities a place accumulated over enough decades of a person paying close attention to it. It happened once more the following week, a different gate, a different pair of horses, and this time Eli. Walking back from the barn, caught the tail end of it, 2 horses at the latch, a third standing off at a careful distance, ears up, watching the yard rather than the gate, like a person keeping watch while somebody else does the work. "It's like they take turns," he said at dinner, not really expecting anyone to do anything with the observation. Nobody did. Josie laughed. Wade offered up a line about horses being creatures of habit. The comment sank into the general noise of the table and was gone by dessert. Chapter 3. There was a particular kind of morning that came a few times that summer, dawn coming up clean and gold over grass gone thick again from the back field's water, the whole herd out grazing in loose, easy clusters, nothing about the scene wrong to look at, nothing a stranger driving past would have paused for even a second. He stood at the fence some of those mornings with his coffee and let himself believe, for the length of one cup, that everything he'd been noticing was just a man getting older and more careful, seeing patterns where there weren't any. Wren's project was called, in her head, Same Spot, though she hadn't told anyone that yet, because it sounded pretentious out loud, and she was 14, and things sounding pretentious mattered more than almost anything else in the world right now. The idea was simple. The same horse, the same angle, the same spot by the fence post near the old oak, once every week or two, for as long as she could keep it up. She wanted to see what a whole season looked like, laid end to end. Every time she went out to shoot it, she pushed her second-hand glasses back up her nose with the back of her wrist, narrow and quick like her mother had been at that age, not built solid like the rest of them, and mostly forgot she was doing it. She'd been at it 2 months now. The horse was a bay mare named Clover, mostly because Clover held still better than the others and had a blaze that made a good visual anchor in the frame. Wren didn't look at the photos side by side very often. She took them, she filed them, she moved on to the next thing that was interesting, which on any given week was rarely the folder of horse pictures she'd taken the week before. "You're gonna have like 400 pictures of one horse," Josie told her once, not unkindly. "That's the point," Wren said, and went back to adjusting her tripod. She'd started the project mostly because a summer photography class had assigned nearly this exact thing, and she'd never actually turned the assignment in. The class ended. The habit didn't. Somewhere in the months since, it had stopped being homework and become just a thing she did, much like Eli's cameras had stopped being a hobby and become just a thing he did. Neither of them had ever really talked about it that way. It was just how the ranch's quieter kids passed the parts of the day nobody else was paying attention to. Eli liked to hang around while she worked, not because he cared much about photography, but because Wren, unlike most of the rest of the family, would actually explain things to him at his own pace without making it feel like a lesson. "Why do you always shoot her from the same side?" he asked once, sitting cross-legged in the grass while she adjusted the tripod for the third time. "Consistency. If I change the angle every time, I can't actually compare anything later. It's got to be the same, or it doesn't mean anything." "That's basically what I do with the trail cam." "Yeah," Wren said, glancing over at him with something close to actual respect. "Kind of is." They didn't talk much more than that. Most afternoons, just sat together in the easy, undemanding way siblings 4 years apart sometimes managed better than siblings closer in age. Him watching her work, her occasionally showing him a shot she liked. Wyatt called on Sundays mostly from a dorm room 2 states over that he described, accurately, as smelling permanently like someone else's ramen. He didn't hear much about the gate latches or the staring or any of the small strange things accumulating back home because nobody thought, yet, that any of it was worth interrupting a phone call to mention. Mostly, he heard about Josie's barrel times and Renee's pancake opinions and Earl's fence report, same as always. And mostly he missed the ranch in the uncomplicated, homesick way you miss a place. Nothing has actually gone wrong yet. "Tell Clover I said hi," he told Josie at the end of one call, and didn't think about it again until he was back on the property weeks later with a handful of stitches. It was Wade who found the trough. The same week, the eyes started catching in his memory at odd hours. 3 in the afternoon, driving past the east paddock, noticing that the big galvanized water trough had somehow ended up a good 4 feet from where it always sat. No drag marks in the dirt, no obvious way anything had moved it there. Every horse in that paddock stood in more or less its usual place, grazing, unbothered, as if the trough had simply always been where it now was. He walked the whole fence line that afternoon. Every latch was closed. Every gate was where it should be. There was nothing wrong, technically, with anything he could point to. Just one heavy object sitting 4 feet from where 4 generations of Colters had always kept it, moved by nothing he could explain and noticed, he suspected, by nobody but him. He didn't mention it at dinner that night either. It was 3 in the morning when Wade woke up, and he woke up for no reason he could name. Not a sound, not a dream he remembered, just the particular dry-mouthed nothing of being 30 seconds from being thirsty enough to get out of bed for it. He lay there a moment, deciding whether it was worth it. It was worth it. He got up quiet, so as not to wake Renee, who slept like she did everything else, completely, with her whole self, no half-measures. He didn't turn on a light going down the hall. He knew this house in the dark better than he knew most things in daylight. The window over the kitchen sink looked out on the near pasture, and there was a horse standing close to the glass, close enough that Wade's first thought wasn't alarm. It was something almost like tenderness, the reflexive kind you get for an animal you've raised from a foal. Did I forget to shut the gate? Is she hurt? Is she cold? He stepped closer to the glass, already halfway into the motion of going to check on her, hand already reaching for where his boots sat by the mudroom door. The horse didn't move. It had probably been watching the window before he ever got up, and there was a strange comfort in that for a second, being looked at, being seen by something that knew him, before the comfort turned into something else, something Wade couldn't yet name, because he was still looking at the wrong part of it. It was the angle that got him first. Not the eyes themselves. The angle. He was looking straight into both of them at once, dead on, like he'd look at a person's face. Horses didn't let you do that. A horse's eyes sat wide on the sides of its skull, and you were always looking at a horse's eye, singular, from the side, because that was where the eye was. He was looking at two. Wade stood very still, the water glass forgotten in his hand, and understood, in the slow, sinking way you understand something your body has already accepted before your mind has caught up, that the horse's eyes had moved. Migrated forward, both of them, close enough together now that they'd both fit into a single, direct human line of sight. He had grown up around horses. He had delivered foals with his bare hands. He had never once, in 40 years, been looked at by one, not alongside, not in profile, not the patient sideways watching he knew, but straight on, both eyes fixed and steady, the way another person looks at you when they've decided you're worth their whole attention. He reached for his phone on the counter, meaning to get a light on it, get Renee, get something. In the half-second his eyes were off the window, he heard nothing. No hoofbeat, no shifting weight, no sound of an animal 1,500 pounds moving off in the dark. When he looked back up, the horse was gone. He stood at the sink a long time after that, the water running, untouched, down the drain. He didn't tell Renee that night. He told himself it was because she had an early shift, and that was true. But it wasn't the whole truth, and some part of him already knew it wasn't. What he did instead, the next evening at dinner, over Renee's terrible/wonderful attempt at a new recipe that had gone slightly too far in the direction of cumin, was ask, casually, like it didn't matter, "Anybody else notice the horses acting different lately?" "Calmer," Josie said immediately. "Weird about the gaits," Eli offered, not looking up. "They've been standing around a lot," Wren said. "Like, staring." Wade nodded slowly, like he was filing this away with the rest of the ordinary noise of the table, and did not mention the window and the eyes and the comfort that had curdled into something he still didn't have a word for, not that night and not for several nights after. "Probably the heat," Earl said from the end of the table, and went back to his beans. Faye watched her husband say it, and watched her son accept it, and said nothing, because there was nothing in her own memory solid enough yet to offer instead, just a faint, old unease she couldn't trace back to anything specific, the kind you learn, after enough decades, not to trust your own mouth to explain. Chapter 4. Faye had been driving out to the Whitfield place every week or so for longer than she could easily account for. Harold's knees weren't what they'd been, a stooped, big-knuckled old man who still insisted on doing his own mowing regardless, and Vivian, silver-haired and sharp-eyed behind her bifocals, had given up on the far pasture fence line 2 winters back. It was just what you did for people you'd known 40 years, the same way they'd have done it for you. Sometimes it was groceries. Sometimes it was just sitting on Vivian's porch for 20 minutes listening to her complain warmly about her grandkids and driving home again. The car was in the driveway. That was the first thing Faye noticed, a car being where it should be, without thinking much about it, right up until the rest of the picture doesn't match. Nobody answered the door. She knocked twice, waited, tried the handle out of habit more than suspicion, and it turned. "Harold?" she called into the front hall. "Vivian?" The house had the particular stillness of a house that's simply empty, not a house where something's wrong. The television off, a coffee mug on the counter with an inch left in it, gone cold. Their 2 horses were out in the side pasture, unbothered, tails swishing at flies in the afternoon heat, looking about as ordinary as horses could look. "They're probably off with one of the kids," Faye said, back in the truck to Earl, who was waiting behind the wheel. "Door was unlocked, though," Earl said, not alarmed, just noting it, same as he noted most things. "Well, nobody locks anything out here." They decided, without much discussion, to swing back by tomorrow. Earl figured he'd send Wade instead. His knees weren't much better than Harold's, if he was honest about it, and the walk down to check the back pasture fence while he was there wasn't a walk he was eager to make twice in 2 days. "You worried?" Faye asked him, on the drive home, watching the side of his face the way she'd been watching it for 50 years. "No," Earl said, and meant it, mostly. There was something under the no he couldn't have named if she'd pushed him on it. Not worry exactly, just a faint, old static, the feeling you get walking past a room in your own house you never go into anymore. He didn't mention it. There wasn't anything to mention yet. Wade drove over to the Whitfield place that afternoon, expecting the same non-event Earl and Fay had described. An empty house, a couple of horses standing around, a call to make to Harold's kids to sort out where everybody'd gotten to. The Whitfield place sat a half-mile up the county road from the Colters, a smaller single-story house set close to its own gravel drive, with the pasture running out flat behind it toward the same stand of cottonwoods that marked the Colters' northwest corner from the other side. He didn't get past the driveway. The horses weren't scattered and grazing the way they'd been the day before. They were bunched in a loose crescent between the gravel drive and the porch steps facing the drive, and as Wade's truck rolled to a stop maybe 30 feet short of the house, they didn't scatter like spooked animals do. They came toward him, all at once, a controlled, stamping advance that stopped just short of the truck and started again, over and over, testing something Wade couldn't name. One of them was foaming at the mouth, a thick white lather at the corners of its jaw, and up close, in the low afternoon light, Wade could see their flanks were dark with sweat despite the mild heat, breathing hard in a way that didn't match the short distance any of them had actually moved. Wade's mind did what minds do with something this wrong, reached immediately for the nearest thing that would still let him breathe normally. Rabies. Something's got into the water. Something's sick. He didn't get out of the truck. He put it in reverse and backed the whole length of the driveway with 3 horses pacing alongside the window, close enough to touch, and the moment the truck's rear tires cleared the gate line, they stopped. They didn't follow on to the road. They only cared about the house. The Bridgewater County Sheriff's substation was a single-story brick building that had been the same building, more or less, since before Wade was born. And the deputy behind the counter, Hank Pruitt, a heavy-set, sandy-haired man who'd gone a little soft in the years since he'd played ball with Wade, looked up before Wade had finished getting the screen door shut behind him. Wade had known him since they were both boys throwing rocks at the same creek. They'd been in the same grade all the way through, played on the same losing baseball team 2 summers running, stood up in each other's weddings a decade apart. It was a small enough county that everybody knew everybody, but Wade and Hank went a layer deeper than that, a friendship that never needed much upkeep because it had never needed much to begin with. Wade, what's wrong? Can't reach Harold and Vivian. House has been empty 2 days. Cars there, and their horses just about ran me off the property. Pruitt's face did something small and serious, the look of a man doing math he didn't like the answer to. "Sit down a second," he said, already reaching for the phone. "I've got a number for their boy in Spokane." Wade sat. He listened to half a conversation. "Hey, it's Hank Pruitt out at the county." "No, nothing like that. Just checking. You haven't heard from them?" "No, all right. I'll call you back," and watched something shift in Pruitt's face that Wade recognized, because it was the same thing that had been sitting in his own chest since the driveway. "They don't have them," Pruitt said, hanging up. "Kid sounded surprised I was even asking." They drove back up together, Pruitt's cruiser trailing Wade's truck, and the horses that had blocked the driveway that afternoon were simply not there anymore. No herd in the yard, no pacing shapes by the fence. Churned mud marked where they'd been standing. A section of the near fence had been pushed flat, the wire slack and trampled into the dirt. Pruitt crouched by the mud a long moment, running 2 fingers along the deepest of the churned tracks, the way he might have read sign on any ordinary call. "Nothing here says which way they went," he said, finally straightening. "Ground's too torn up to tell." "So what do you make of it?" "I believe something happened here I don't have a report form for," Pruitt said, which was, Wade understood, about as far as a working deputy was willing to go on a Tuesday afternoon with no body and no proof, and he didn't press him for more than that. Pruitt clapped him once on the shoulder before they parted at the trucks, an old, easy gesture between 2 men who'd known each other longer than either of their marriages, and told him to call the station directly if anything else turned up, day or night. No need to go through dispatch. Wade nodded, shook his hand, and drove home, turning the whole strange afternoon over in his head the entire way. There was no explanation for where 1,500 pounds of horse, times 3, had gone in the space of an hour, and neither man said much of anything else about it on the drive back down. Eli's trail cam sat wedged into the fork of a fence post near the property's north edge, close enough to the Whitfield line that half the footage it caught most nights was deer working the tree break between the two ranches. He didn't check it every night. He checked it most mornings, over cereal, one thumb moving through thumbnails while the other kept the spoon going, barely glancing down at the bowl at all. That morning, there was motion flagged at 1:47 a.m. He watched it twice before he said anything to anyone. Not because there was anything to see exactly, but because there wasn't, not cleanly. The footage showed two shoe shapes he recognized as the Whitfield's horses, moving along the fence line slower than deer moved, closer to the camera than they usually came. Then a third shape entered from the left of frame, one of the Colter's own, unmistakable even in grainy infrared by the size of it. And there was a burst of motion, all three shapes compressing into something the camera's low-light range couldn't resolve into anything but movement, and then, a few seconds later, stillness. No sound on this camera, no clean angle, just motion, then not. Eli watched it a third time and then closed the app and didn't tell anyone yet because he didn't know what he'd seen, and telling people things he wasn't sure about hadn't gone well for him before. He went out to the spot himself before school, which in hindsight was not something a 13-year-old should have done alone, though it didn't occur to him at the time to think of it that way. The ground near the fence line was torn up, real gouges in the dirt, grass pulled loose in clumps, the unmistakable evidence of something happening there with weight and speed behind it. No blood, no carcass. Nothing he could point to and say, "Here, this proves it." Just ground that had been fine yesterday and wasn't fine now. He stood there a while longer than he needed to, the useless kind of looking a person does when hoping the picture will finally resolve itself. And it didn't, and eventually he had to go catch the bus. He sat near the back, forehead against the window, and didn't hear a word anyone said to him the whole ride. Wade found the blood a couple hours later, and completely separately, with no idea I had been out at that fence line at all. He was doing what he did most mornings, checking the water troughs before the heat came up, and the big galvanized barrel by the east paddock had gone a color it had no business being. A rust-brown cloud settled through the water that hadn't cleared even after he ran his hand through it. He checked every horse in that paddock. No cuts, no wounds, no limping, no favoring, nothing. He stood there a long moment with his hands still wet, looking at a piece of evidence that told him something had happened and refused, completely, to tell him what. He thought about mentioning it at breakfast and didn't, in the end, because there wasn't anything to say yet that wouldn't sound like panic, and panic wasn't a thing Wade let himself hand to his family before he understood what it was for. Wade found Eli in the barn that evening, knees drawn up to his chest on an overturned bucket, tablet held close to his face, shoulders curled in on themselves in a way Wade didn't like the look of at all. "Hey," Wade said, sitting down on an overturned bucket beside him. "Can I see that?" Eli looked up, surprised enough that it took him a second to hand the tablet over. Wade watched the footage, the two shapes at the fence, the third entering frame, the burst and stillness, and his thumb went still on the screen, like it had stopped taking orders from the rest of him. Wade set the tablet down and looked straight at Eli, taking him in properly for the first time since he'd sat down, the automatic parental once-over checking for anything that looked hurt before his mouth caught up to it. "You went out and looked at the ground," he said. Not a question. Eli shrugged one shoulder, not quite meeting his father's eyes. "Yeah, it was just kicked up, nothing else." Wade nodded slowly, breathing out long through his nose, his eyes drifting past Eli toward the open barn door and the dark fields beyond it. "I found blood in the east trough this morning. No wound on any horse I could find." They sat with that for a while, the two pieces sitting next to each other for the first time, not resolving into anything either of them could say out loud, but no longer separate. I tried to tell people stuff before, Eli said finally, not quite looking at his father. Nobody really... I know, Wade said. I'm sorry about that. He didn't say anything else, because anything else he tried came out sounding smaller than it needed to be, and Eli, to his credit, didn't make him try to finish it. You believe me now? Eli asked, quieter, like he wasn't sure he wanted the answer. I believe you saw something, Wade said. I'm just not sure what yet. Eli leaned into his father's chest, and Wade put an arm around him, and the two of them sat there a while longer on their overturned buckets, not saying anything else. Chapter 5. The search for Harold and Vivian Whitfield ran 4 days, pulled in county resources and a dozen volunteers, and for a while was the only thing anyone in town talked about. Wade spent 2 of those days walking grid lines with a search party that included half the men he'd grown up with, calling names into woods that gave nothing back, breaking for coffee at a folding table someone's wife had set up in the church parking lot, going home each night with his boots caked in mud from ground that had turned up nothing, and a silence in the truck cab that Renee had learned by the second night not to try to fill. It turned up nothing. No trail, no bodies, no horses either. Harold and Vivian's own 2 never turned up anywhere on the property or off it. The town did what small towns do with a grief that has no answer attached to it. It circled quietly, without quite knowing what to do with its hands. Casseroles showed up at the Whitfield's children's doorsteps 1,000 miles away, forwarded through a niece nobody had met. The church held a Wednesday service that wasn't quite a funeral, since there was nothing yet to bury, just an hour of people sitting together in a room, saying Harold and Vivian's names out loud, like that alone might do some good. Faye went. Wade went. Renee took a shift off she couldn't really afford to take off, and sat between them, and didn't say much, because there wasn't much to say that the room wasn't already saying just by being full. Afterward, in the gravel lot, an old rancher named Dale Torres, who'd known Harold since they were young men, caught Wade's arm on the way to the truck. You believe in coyotes doing something like that? He asked, low, not really a question aimed at getting an answer. Some fella at the feed stores saying it was coyotes. I don't know what to believe, Wade said, which was true, and which was also the most he was willing to say to anyone standing in a church parking lot, however many years he'd known them. Dale nodded slowly, like a man nodding at an answer he'd already expected, and didn't much like either. Wade heard the outcome secondhand from Earl, who'd heard it at the feed store. Just like they up and disappeared, the search coordinator had apparently said, and Earl repeated it exactly that way, like the plainness of the phrase was the closest any of them could get to saying it out loud. Buried somewhere in 4 days of radio chatter and search grid logistics was a comment nobody thought twice about, a state game warden mentioning, almost as an aside to another warden, that he'd found a dead fawn out past the tree line between the 2 properties. Presenting like wasting disease, he said. Thin, patchy, looked like it'd been stumbling before it went down. Shouldn't even be old enough for that, he added, and somebody made a note of it, and somebody else mentioned a few deer out this way looking skinny this year, and the sample got bagged for testing more or less as a formality, a box checked because protocol said to check it, not because anyone expected it to matter. He knelt a moment longer before he bagged it, out of the same habit that made him look twice at anything that didn't sit quite right, and noted the eyes last of all. Round, not the horizontal slit a deer's pupil should hold, open still, staring up at nothing. He didn't have a box on his intake form for that particular observation. He wrote it in the margin anyway, in handwriting nobody at the lab would likely take the time to read closely, and moved on to the next grid square on his list. Earl didn't sleep well the night after the search wrapped, and somewhere in the gray hour before dawn, half awake, he found himself back in a field he hadn't thought about in longer than he could say. He was 8. He knew he was 8 the way you know things in a memory that's mostly feeling and no timeline, small for his age, standing in tall grass with his mother's hand closing hard around his arm before he'd even understood there was a reason for it. And then he was up, off his feet, carried, her whole body angled between him and something behind her that he never got a clear look at, only the sense of it. And one detail that had never once, in 70 years, come loose from the rest. A horse standing very still, watching them go, its eyes set wrong on its face, too far forward, too much like a person's eyes, watching like a person watches, not like a horse ever had, and then a cry coming out of it that had no business belonging to anything with 4 legs, a sound that found every nerve he had and never quite let go of them either. He didn't remember what happened after that. The memory simply ended, the way memories from that age often did, mid-scene, no before and no after attached to it. There was a second fragment, disconnected from the first by some gap of days or weeks he'd never been able to close. His father, later, how much later, he didn't know, standing in the yard with the other men, all of them home from somewhere, nobody talking, nobody quite looking at each other either. Blood on his father's shirt, on his hands, on his face where he'd wiped his forehead with the back of his wrist. Nobody had explained it to Earl then. Nobody had explained it to him since. He lay in the dark beside Faye, who was asleep, or pretending to be, and turned the 2 fragments over yet again, 100th time across a whole life of doing it, looking for a seam where they connected, and found, as always, nothing. Just 2 pictures, no story between them. Life did the thing life does, which is continue, whether or not it has any right to. Dinner still happened. Renee still burned the good news of her day into the room the second she walked through the door. A patient's kid had drawn her a get-well card meant for someone else entirely, and she'd kept it anyway, propped now on the windowsill above the sink, a lopsided sun with a face on it. Josie still had barrel racing circuits to argue about. Earl still gave his 3 careful boot wipes on the mat. But there was a texture under it now, one nobody named. Wade caught himself checking the pasture from the kitchen window more than he used to. Faye's habitual daily walk past the near paddock got a little less habitual, a little more deliberate, though she'd have told you she was just checking the water, nothing more than that. Even Renee, who ran on a kind of relentless daily cheer that had gotten this family through worse things than a bad drought, found herself doing small extra things she couldn't quite explain, double-checking the deadbolt at night, keeping her phone charged on the nightstand instead of the kitchen counter. At work, her mind kept drifting back to the ranch more than it used to, and twice that week she'd had to ask a coworker to repeat herself because her attention had wandered, unbidden, 40 minutes down the highway to a place she couldn't do anything about from a hospital hallway. "You okay?" Denise asked her the second time. "Fine," Renee said, and mostly meant it, and went back to charting and thought about the herd anyway. "You've been quiet," she said to Wade one night, in bed, in the dark, in the voice she used when she meant it as an actual question and not just a thing you say. "Just tired," Wade said, and felt her go still beside him in the particular way that meant she wasn't buying it. He let out a breath and tried again. Been thinking about the kids being out there so much on their own, Eli walking that fence line by himself to check his camera, Josie riding further out than she used to. "That's new," Renee said. "You've never minded them being out there before." "I know, maybe I'm just getting old and nervous about it." He wasn't going to tell her about the window, not yet, not until he had something more solid to hand her than his own 2 eyes and a bad night's sleep. "And the herd," he added after a while. "I keep saying they've been off. You've probably heard me say it 6 times by now. Closer to 10. I don't have a good reason for it, just a feeling I can't shake." Renee turned onto her side to look at him in the dark. "Then we keep an eye on it. Together. You don't have to carry the odd feeling around by yourself, Wade." He didn't say anything else, but he found her hand under the blanket and held onto it a while. Wyatt came home on a Friday, duffel bag over one shoulder, and Renee met him at the door with both arms out, half a hug and half a full-body inspection, checking for weight loss and haircuts and anything else a mother could catalog in 4 seconds flat. He'd filled out some through the chest since he'd left, the stubble on his jaw a couple days past due for a razor. Dark hair longer than Wade would have let it get. but he still moved like the same lanky kid who'd gone off to school 2 years back, just a slightly taller, more tired version of him. "You look like a scarecrow," she said, pinching his side. "Eat something." "Missed you too," he said, smiling. Dinner that night was loud in the good way, everyone talking over everyone. Eli showing Wyatt 3 months of trail cam footage he'd apparently been saving up specifically for this moment. Josie giving him a full accounting of the herd, like a foreman handing off a shift. Ren showing him, briefly, a couple of frames from her project, before deciding the timing wasn't right to explain the whole thing and putting her phone away again. Nobody mentioned the Whitfields to him that night. It felt, without anyone deciding it out loud, like something you eased a person into rather than opened with. Wade found him on the porch later, once the noise of dinner had died down, sitting on the top step with his boots off and his feet bare against the wood, the way he used to sit as a kid, too impatient to wait for morning. "You look tired," Wade said, easing himself down onto the step beside him, knees cracking loud enough that Wyatt huffed a laugh. "Finals." Wyatt leaned back on his elbows, tipping his face up toward what was left of the light. "You look older." "I am older. That's generally how it works." Wyatt laughed, short and real, and for a while neither of them said much of anything, just sat there with the dark coming down over the pasture, crickets starting up somewhere past the fence, the porch boards still warm under them from the day's heat. "Missed this," Wyatt said eventually. Wade breathed out slow, some of the tightness easing out of his shoulders. "Missed having you around is more like it." "Me too, Dad. Me too." The next morning, before anyone else was properly up, Wyatt went out to the near pasture the way he always used to. No saddle, no bridle beyond a loose rope halter, just him and Clover, exactly as it had been since he was 15. It was a ritual older than most of the rituals in this family, older than some of the kids. She was waiting near the gate the way she always seemed to know to be, and he crossed to her unhurried, pressing his forehead briefly against hers, a habit as old as he was, murmuring her name like a greeting two old friends had worked out between them long before either of them needed words for it. He ran a hand slow down the length of her neck and scratched the spot behind her ear she'd always favored, and she leaned into it the same way she always had, warm and solid and entirely herself. He swung up like he'd done 100 times, easy, unthinking, one hand braced flat against her withers and the other closing into her mane for balance as his weight settled. The pain was immediate and strange. Not a cut, not quite, something closer to a puncture. Several small points at once, driven into his palm where his fingers had closed. He pulled his hand back with a short, surprised sound and found blood welling up across his palm in a neat constellation of small wounds, and beneath the loosened hair of Clover's mane, where his hand had been, something hard and ridged that had absolutely no business being there. Clover didn't flinch, didn't shy, didn't so much as swing her head around to see what had happened. She stood exactly as still as she had a moment before, as if her body had registered none of it. Wyatt stood in the pasture holding his own bleeding hand, staring at a horse that hadn't reacted to being gripped hard enough to draw blood, and had to make himself breathe out slow before he trusted his own legs enough to move. He backed away from her slow, not quite trusting himself to turn his back on her yet. And it was only near the gate that he noticed the rest of the herd drifting in from the far end of the pasture, unhurried, closing in around Clover, a habit they'd taken to lately without anyone calling them to it. One of them let out a low, held note just as he latched the gate behind him, not quite a whinny, the pitch of it bending somewhere in the middle like it had somewhere else to be entirely, and Wyatt didn't wait around to hear whether it happened again. Renee cleaned and dressed the wound at the kitchen table 20 minutes later, her nurse's hands quick and sure, and her face doing the thing it did at work. The flat, assessing calm that meant she was thinking harder than she was letting on. "That's not a rope burn," she said, mostly to herself, turning his hand toward the light to get a better look at the spacing. Too clean for a bite, too evenly spaced, almost deliberate, looks more like a row of needles than anything with teeth. She turned it over once more, chasing the thought, and came up empty. "That's not anything I've got a name for." She looked up from his hand and straight into his eyes. How the hell did you get that, Wyatt? Wyatt sat forward, elbows braced on his knees, turning the bandaged hand over slow like he could will a better answer out of it. I don't know, Mom. I grabbed her mane the way I always do, and it just hurt, all at once, like grabbing a fistful of something with teeth in it. And she didn't move, didn't even look back at me. She just stood there like nothing happened. His voice caught on the last of it, quieter than he meant it to come out. Renee crouched down in front of him, both hands wrapped around his good one, studying his face now instead of the wound. Her grip on his hand tightened without her seeming to notice she'd done it, and for a long moment neither of them said anything else. Nobody at the table had a name for it either. Wade caught Earl's eye across the table. Neither of them said anything. Earl was already pushing his chair back. Chapter 6. They found Clover grazing easy at the far end of the pasture, calm as anything, and Wade approached her slow, murmuring the way Wyatt always did, before running his own hand up under her mane. Earl stood a few feet off, quiet, watching his son's face more than the horse. Wade found it inside a few seconds. Hard, ridged growths running along the base of her neck, hidden under the hair, spaced close enough together that closing a fist around her mane would catch 2 or 3 of them without meaning to. He counted 6 before he stopped counting, because counting wasn't going to change what his hand already knew. Earl stepped in and felt it for himself without being asked, his jaw setting as his fingers moved along the ridge, and said nothing, which from Earl was its own kind of answer. Wade called the emergency vet line from the truck before either of them had said a word about what came next. "I need somebody out here as soon as you can get somebody out here," he said. "Found something on one of my horses I don't have a name for." The vet who came was younger than the one they usually used, running the overnight line solo out of the regional clinic, and she didn't waste much time on pleasantries either. She knelt and ran her own fingers along the ridge of growth, the same way Wade and Earl had, her face going carefully blank, someone deciding not to react until she had more to react to. "I've never felt anything like this on a horse," she said finally. "Bone spurs don't grow like this, not spaced, not this uniform. I want a biopsy if you'll let me, and I want you watching every other horse in this herd for anything similar." "Could rabies do something like this?" Wade asked. "The neighbors' horses, before they went missing, they were foaming at the mouth, aggressive as anything I've seen. Wouldn't let me near the place." She considered that, still crouched by Clover's neck. Foaming, maybe, if it's advanced enough. But rabies doesn't grow anything on an animal's body. It doesn't do this. She shook her head slow. "Whatever's causing this isn't in any textbook I've studied." She took the sample right there in the pasture, sliding the needle deep into the ridge of growth without much ceremony, the kind of thing that should have made any horse alive flinch, pull back, stamp a foot, anything. Clover didn't so much as swing her head around. Wade caught Earl's eye over her back, and for a second, neither of them needed to say a word about what that meant. Wade watched her work and didn't mention the eyes at the window, or the trough, or any of the rest of it. Some of it he still didn't have words for himself. Some of it he wasn't ready to say out loud to anyone who might have to write it down in a report. Renee found Wade out by the barn later that night, sitting on the same overturned bucket he'd sat on with Eli a week before, not doing anything, just sitting. "We could go stay with my sister a while," she said, not as an opening move, more like a decision she'd already turned over enough times that it came out sounding settled rather than asked. "Just until somebody figures out what's actually going on out here. And leave the herd." "I don't care about the herd, Wade. I care about our son needing 4 stitches because a horse let him grab a fistful of whatever that was and didn't even flinch." Wade didn't have an answer for that, not one that held up under its own weight, and they sat there a while in the kind of silence that wasn't unfriendly, just heavy. Wade scuffed the toe of his boot through the dirt, once, hard, and dragged a hand down over his face before he answered. "This is my dad's whole life," he said finally. "His dad's before that. I don't know how to just leave it standing here." "I know." Renee sat down beside him, close enough that their shoulders touched. "I'm not saying tonight. I'm saying I want you to actually consider it Instead of just, she gestured at the dark pasture, at all of it, riding it out because that's what you've always done. I'm considering it, he said, placing one hand on her knee. Okay. She didn't push further. She'd learned, same as she'd learned with Eli's quiet, that Wade needed room to arrive at things rather than be walked to them. And she leaned her head against his shoulder instead and let the two of them sit with it, unresolved. The way most of the hardest conversations in a marriage end up sitting for a while before they're actually finished. He brought it up again himself, a few days later, over coffee before the rest of the house was up. Told her he'd thought about it, thought about what leaving would actually mean. The land, his father's whole life, 4 kids pulled out of a school they knew. He didn't have an answer yet. He wanted her to know he'd actually turned it over rather than just let it sit. That's all I wanted, Renee said, and meant it. It was raining the following week, the first real rain in what felt like a season, and Ren spent the gray afternoon doing the thing she'd been putting off for a month, actually sitting down with the same spot folder and laying the photos out in order, side by side on her bedspread, trying to pick the 6 or 8 that told the story of the season best. She noticed it on the 4th photo from the end, set next to the first. The blaze down Clover's face, the white marking she'd anchored half her compositions around, didn't sit where it used to sit. It had crept over the 2 months of photos, down and slightly to the left, bleeding into territory that had been solid bay before. She told herself for about 30 seconds that it was a lighting difference, a white balance thing, some quirk of her camera settings she hadn't accounted for. Then she noticed the jaw. She'd shot every photo in near profile because profile was where the light did the nicest thing along a horse's face and lined up end to end. The profile of Clover's jaw in the last photo sat longer, heavier than it had 2 months before. Not dramatically, not in any single frame, but undeniably across the sequence, like a slow-motion video showing a collision a still photo would miss entirely. Ren sat very still on her bed for a long moment, 8 photographs spread in front of her, and thought about her brother's trail cam, and thought, without being able to say exactly why, that she should probably show somebody this. She brought the tablet down to dinner instead of waiting, setting it on the table between the serving dishes without much preamble. I want to show you guys something. Just look at the blaze on her face, and then look at her jaw, first picture to last. Dinner went quiet in a way it rarely did in this house. Wade took the tablet first, scrolling slow, his face giving away less than Renee's did beside him. Hers tightened somewhere around the 4th photo, and she looked up and caught Wade's eye across the table, a look that didn't need any words attached to it. Earl leaned in over Faye's shoulder to see, and went still in the same particular way he'd gone still out in the pasture with Clover. Wyatt took it last, turning the tablet sideways, holding his thumb and forefinger stretched between the first photo and the last like he could measure the difference that way. That's not lighting, Renee said finally, quiet, mostly to Wade. No, Wade agreed, it's not. Nobody at the table had a theory that fit all of it. Not the blaze, not the jaw, not the growths under Clover's mane, not any of it laid end to end. They passed the tablet around twice more anyway, like enough looking might turn up an answer none of them had found the first time, and dinner went on quieter than any dinner this family could remember having. Faye mentioned it to Earl first, low, over coffee one morning before the rest of the house was up. 3 nights now of something in the herd calling out that didn't sound right to her, restless and hoarse, enough that she'd lain awake most of it. Earl didn't say much back. He set his cup down slower than usual, and told her she ought to make sure Wade heard about it properly, not just in passing, and that it was worth pushing on until somebody came out to look. He didn't say why it mattered enough to push. Faye didn't ask. The vet came out because of the noise in the end. 3 separate nights of restless calling from the herd, loud enough that Faye had lost sleep over it, and she made sure to say so plainly at breakfast this time. Plainly enough that Wade decided it was worth the call before he'd even finished his coffee. Dr. Alma Reyes had been the Colters' large animal vet for going on 15 years, a wiry, no-nonsense woman in her 60s who still wrestled full-grown geldings without much help, and she'd seen enough real illness in that time to know the difference between a horse being difficult and a horse being sick. She'd delivered 2 of the foals in this very paddock, had pulled Wade through a bad colic scare on his best stud years back, and knew this family well enough that she didn't bother with small talk walking up from her truck. "I got the report back on the biopsy from Clover," she said, before Wade had even gotten the gate latched behind them. "Nothing definitive. Inconclusive is what they're calling it. Whatever that means for growth patterns nobody's ever documented before. I've got a couple feelers out with people at the university, see if anyone's seen anything close to it." Wade nodded, filing that away next to everything else that hadn't added up to an answer yet. "Faye says he's been hoarse," she said, already pulling equipment from her bag, moving on to the reason she was actually out here today. "Since when?" "Couple weeks, best we can tell," Wade said. "Whole herd's been noisier than usual at night. Figured it was worth having someone actually look." She scoped the gelding's throat mostly on a hunch, chasing the hoarseness Faye had described, expecting inflammation, maybe a mild infection. What she found made her sit back from the scope and look at it again, twice, before she said anything. "The fold structure's not right," she said finally, to Wade, who was holding the lead rope and trying to read her face. "I don't have a clean word for it. It's shaped for a wider modulation range than anything a horse should have. I'd need to send this out to someone who studies this for a living." She noted something else while she had the scope out, almost as an aside, checking the eyes out of the same instinct that had made her check the throat. The lids had thickened, more than normal wear would account for, trending towards something with more coverage than a horse's eye should need. "I'm going to be honest with you," she said, packing up her equipment slower than she needed to. "I don't know what I'm looking at." Wade didn't either. But for the first time, he had a professional telling him, in so many words, that it ain't right. Chapter 7. Earl found the busted feed bucket a few days later, out behind the barn where the good buckets went once they'd cracked, and it took him a minute of turning it over in his hands to understand what he was looking at. Not a crack from age or a kick from an impatient horse, but 2 clean punctures straight through the heavy plastic, spaced the width of a jaw. He didn't say much about it to anyone. He set it aside with the other broken things meant for the burn pile, and went on with his morning, same as he went on with every morning, quiet, steady, the work in front of him mattering more, most days, than the questions he didn't have good answers for. He didn't burn that bucket, though. He put it instead in the bed of his truck, under a tarp, telling himself he'd bring it to Faye once he had more than a hunch to hand her. It wasn't that they made a habit of keeping things from each other. They never had, not in 50 years. But some things weren't worth putting on the person he loved most until he actually knew what they were. Josie noticed the first of it while grooming Ranger, running a curry comb along her barrel, same as she'd done 10,000 times before, and finding, under her palm, a patch along the ribs that didn't give the way flesh gave. She pressed harder, thinking maybe the mare had knocked herself on something, and the hardness didn't move, didn't have the tenderness of a bruise, just sat there under the coat, like a plate of something that had no business being under a horse's skin. She didn't say anything about it right away. Ranger was running the best times of her life that season, clean through every barrel most weekends, and Josie told herself it was probably nothing worth making a fuss over, a knock, some old healed-over injury, the kind of small mystery a working horse picked up now and then. She filed it away instead, deciding that if it hadn't cleared up in a couple of weeks, or if Ranger's time started slipping, or she started hurting, she'd say something then. She noticed the other thing a week later, and this one she couldn't explain away at all. Not a thing she could feel, a thing she could only see, riding Ranger out at a walk toward the east gate. She'd ridden this mare enough years now that her walk had a rhythm to it. Josie had stopped consciously hearing, the way you stop hearing your own house settle. This didn't have that rhythm. She swung down and led Ranger the rest of the way instead, walking alongside her with the reins loose in one hand, watching her legs move from where she could actually see them. Each hoof came down placed, deliberate, like the mare was choosing exactly where its weight went instead of simply going. Josie slowed her own steps to study it better, then stopped outright, and after a moment, Ranger stopped too. Josie looked up from the mare's legs to find Ranger already looking back at her, straight on, both eyes fixed on her face in a way no horse had any business managing. Josie went still, the lead rope gone slack and forgotten in her hand, her breath catching somewhere in her chest and staying there. Ranger didn't blink, didn't swing her head off to the side like a horse's eyes usually forced it to, checking the ground, the fence line, anything else. She just stood there in the open field, holding Josie's stare the way another person would hold it, and it was a long 5 or 6 seconds before Josie trusted her own legs enough to take a step back, and then another, her heart slamming against her ribs the whole time, forcing herself into a slow, deliberate walk when every part of her wanted to run. She kept the lead rope short the rest of the way in, close enough to feel Ranger's shoulder brush hers with every stride, and made herself not look at the mare's face again. Not once, though she could still feel those eyes on her the whole short walk back to the barn, counting her own steps under her breath, just to have anything else in her head to hold on to. The barn lights came into view past the last stretch of fence, warm and yellow against the dimming evening, and Josie felt her shoulders drop an inch at the sight of them, a lit window meaning safety in a way it had never quite meant before tonight. She got Ranger settled into her stall first, hands a little too quick and rough with the latch for how careful she usually was, and then ran the rest of the way to the house, boots loud on the porch steps, nearly dragging herself over the threshold in her hurry and slamming the front door shut behind her hard enough to rattle the frame. "Dad!" Her voice cracked on the second syllable, breath coming in ragged pulls from the run, her back pressed against the closed door to keep herself upright. "Dad! Dad!" She kept calling it, again and again, loud enough that Wren came skidding out of the hallway, and Eli appeared at the top of the stairs, and Faye hurried in from the kitchen still holding a dish towel, all of them converging on the noise before Wade rounded the corner from the mudroom, already moving fast. "Josie, what happened? Are you hurt?" I'm fine. It's Ranger." She had to stop and drag in a real breath before the rest of it would come out, hands still trembling at her sides. Her walk's all wrong, and she was staring at me, straight on, both eyes, the whole time I was leading her in. I wanted to run, Dad. Every part of me wanted to just go, but I couldn't get my legs to do more than walk, and she watched me the entire way like she knew it too. Her eyes had gone wet by the time she got the last of it out, and she scrubbed at them hard with the back of her wrist, embarrassed by it in front of everyone. She'd trusted that horse completely since she was 10 years old, and something about tonight had reached in and taken that away in the space of about 10 seconds flat. Wade crossed the kitchen in 2 steps and pulled her into him, holding on hard enough that she felt it in her ribs. "I'm so sorry," he said, into her hair, and then again, quieter. "So sorry, Josie. I should have said something sooner." He didn't say what. He just held on and let her cry into his shirt without trying to rush her out of it, one hand moving slow over her back, same as when she was small enough to carry. Over the top of her head, he caught Renee's eye, and then Earl's, and something passed between the 3 of them that didn't need words either. "Nobody goes out to that pasture alone," he said, once Josie's breathing had evened out some to the room more than to her. "Not you, not Eli, not Wren, not until we know what we're dealing with." He already knew exactly what she'd meant about the eyes. He didn't tell her why. With the kids no longer allowed out to the pasture on their own, feeding and lockup duties had settled onto Wade and Earl between them. And Wade wouldn't let Renee walk the fence line alone either. Not anymore. So she came along with him some evenings just for the company while he did the rounds. She heard it before he did, which made sense, given what she did for a living. She'd spent 15 years learning to hear the difference between one kind of breathing and another kind of breathing, and it was pure habit, not horse expertise, that made her stop cold beside the paddock. "That doesn't sound right," she said, and stood at the fence a full minute listening to a sound that had no business coming out of anything with a horse's chest. A faint, wet catch at the top of every breath, subtle enough that Wade, walking this same fence line most nights now, hadn't consciously registered it himself. "You sure?" he asked, standing right beside her. "I'm not an equine vet, Wade. I don't know what I'm hearing." She frowned, arms crossed, looking at the horse like she'd look at a patient's chart that didn't add up. "I just know it's not nothing." It was, in the end, one more thing added to a list that was getting harder week by week for any of them to keep calling nothing. Chapter 8. It started at the hour when the light goes long and gold and everything on a ranch starts smelling like the day cooling off. It was the hour Faye had always liked best, and she was already halfway into layering peanut butter onto crackers for after-school snacks, 4 plates lined up on the counter out of 40 years of habit, even though only 3 of the 4 kids still needed feeding this way. Josie was already home. She'd skipped the Barrel Club meet that week, hadn't been able to make herself go since the night with Ranger, and lately she'd taken to camping out on the floor of her parents' room some nights instead of her own, saying it was easier than lying awake listening to whatever kept making noise outside her window. Ren and Eli's bus wasn't due for another 10 minutes. Earl had taken the truck into town that afternoon to bring Renee home. Her car was in the shop. A stupid, ordinary errand, the kind of thing that happens on 100 other days without anyone remembering it afterward. It had been, up until that hour, an unremarkable Tuesday. Josie had spent the afternoon close to the house instead of at the meet, telling herself she just wasn't in the mood for it this week. Ren had spent lunch period editing 3 months of same-spot photos into something like a real sequence, finally ready to show someone. Eli had a new camera battery in his backpack he'd bought with his own allowance, meaning to swap it out that evening. None of them had any way of knowing it was the last ordinary afternoon this house was going to have. Wade was the one who noticed first, coming up from the barn, that the herd wasn't spread across the pasture like it should have been at this hour. It was massed, close to the house, facing it. Eli was still out past the near fence somewhere, headed for his camera to swap that battery, too far off yet to call back without telling the whole herd exactly where to look. He was still working out what that meant when the first one came through the yard at a trot that had no business looking that controlled, and within a minute the house was surrounded on every side that mattered, horses standing at the fence line and past it, into the yard itself, closer than they'd ever come. They weren't grazing. They weren't milling the way a herd mills when something spooked it into a loose, directionless unease. They were positioned, spaced evenly around the house at intervals that felt, even in the first frantic seconds of noticing it, deliberate, like people positioning themselves around something they don't intend to let leave. "Everybody inside," Wade said, and didn't need to say it twice, though even as Josie and Ren and Faye moved for the door, part of him was already scanning the fence line for a small shape that wasn't there yet. Eli heard it from out past the fence, his father's voice carrying flat and hard across the yard. Everybody inside, closer to the tree line at that moment than he was to the house. He turned in time to see the herd already closing the gap between him and the porch, more of them than he could easily count, filling in the exact stretch of yard he'd have needed to cross. He didn't decide to run. That was the thing about it later that he could never quite explain to anyone who asked. There wasn't a moment where he chose it. One second he was standing there with the truth of it sinking in, that getting back the way he'd have to go wasn't something his legs were going to let him do. And the next, his body had already made the decision his mind hadn't caught up to yet. Running. He wasn't running toward anything. He told himself that later too, and it was true, mostly, except his feet had taken the path they always took, the one worn into the grass from months of checking cameras, and that path ran, without him choosing it, toward the tree line that bordered the Whitfield property. Wade caught the movement at the edge of his vision, just as the herd finished closing the gap, a small shape breaking for the tree line instead of the house, and understood in the same half-second both what his son had just decided and how little choice had actually been left in it. Eli! Wade's voice cracked across the yard once and got no answer, and there wasn't time to go after him yet. Not with Faye still herding Josie and Wren through the door. Not with the herd close enough now that every second spent standing in the open was a second too many. Faye had Wyatt and Josie and Wren gathered in the kitchen inside a minute. The landline already in her hand, the dispatcher's voice calm and practiced on the other end. "I've got horses surrounding the house," she said, hearing how strange it sounded even as she said it. "I need somebody out here. My grandson's run off toward the property line. I need..." She was 3 sentences into the address when the horses' calls rose up outside. That same held, bending note she'd been hearing at a distance for weeks now, except closer, more of them joining in at once than she'd ever heard together. And then a loud bang cracked against the side of the house, metal on metal, and the line went dead mid-word, the kitchen lights dying with it, the refrigerator's hum cutting off into a silence that felt much larger than the sound it replaced. "Grandma." "I know," Faye said, already moving to the window, already understanding, from the angle where one of the horses stood near the side of the house, near the breaker box, exactly what had happened and exactly what it meant that it had happened at precisely this moment. She stood there a second with the dead phone still in her hand, and then set it down and reached instead for the CB base unit on the counter, the one Earl had installed years ago, and everyone had mostly stopped thinking about, because it was just as much a fixture of that kitchen as the stove was. Wren had gone very white and very quiet, pressed into the corner by the pantry, with Josie's arm around her. Wyatt stood at the window Faye had just left, one hand flat against the glass, watching shapes move in the dark yard, with an expression Faye recognized without being able to name exactly where from. The particular stillness of someone watching something they don't yet have words to be afraid of. "Away from the windows," she told them, keeping her voice level in the particular way she'd learned raising one son through every ordinary childhood emergency a ranch could produce. The tone that said, "This is manageable," whether or not it was true. Josie moved Wren toward the hallway. Wyatt didn't move at all until Faye said his name a second time, sharper, and then he came too. "Earl, Earl, you there?" She kept her voice steady for the kid's sake, though her hands, working the dial, were not steady at all. "Earl, come in." "I have to go get him," Wade told Faye, already moving for the mudroom. "Get them into the back rooms, away from the windows. Keep trying, Dad." She caught his arm hard, just for a second, her eyes bright and fixed hard on his face like she was trying to memorize it. "Wade." "I know." He didn't have anything better to give her than that, and she let him go. Wyatt started for the door too. "I'm coming with you." Wade caught him by the shoulders before he'd made it 2 steps, holding him there hard enough that Wyatt had to look at him instead of past him. "No, I need you here." "Dad, he's out there alone." "I know that." Wade's grip didn't ease up. "And I need somebody I trust standing between your grandmother and that door while I go get him. That's you, not me, you." He waited until he saw it land. "Can you do that?" Wyatt's jaw worked for a second, and then he nodded once, hard. "Good man." Wade let go of him and was already moving. He slipped out through the mudroom rather than risking the front, using the angle of the house itself as cover, and worked his way along the fence line past the propane tank in the old equipment shed before breaking for the tree line. The herd was thickest around the porch and the kitchen window, drawn wherever their attention had settled, and the back of the property was the closest thing to clear ground he was going to find tonight. Once he was in the trees, he moved fast at first, and then, within 100 yards, forced himself to slow down, because fast and loud was a good way to run straight into whatever had already scared his son into the dark. He listened more than he moved. Twice he froze at a sound that might have been hooves and turned out to be nothing. Wind through dry brush, his own pulse loud enough in his ears to fool him. Once he went the wrong direction entirely, 30 yards down a deer trail before some instinct told him it was wrong, and doubled back with his chest tight in a way that had nothing to do with the running. He had a handheld radio clipped to his belt. He thought, more than once, about keying it, about saying Eli's name into it, and hoping for an answer. He didn't. Whatever was out here with them, he didn't want to be the one who told it where to look. So he moved instead like he'd learned to move as a boy hunting this same land with his own father. Slow, weight rolled from heel to toe, stopping every dozen steps, just to listen to whatever the woods wanted to tell him. The light was going fast now, the last of the gold burning off into the flat gray that comes right before real dark, and every shadow between the trees looked, for one heart-stopping second each, like something standing in it. He called Eli's name once, low, more breath than voice, and got nothing back. He tried again 50 yards on, same result, and made himself stop calling after that, because a voice carried out here farther than he wanted anything to carry tonight. A branch snapped somewhere off to his left, and he went still against a tree trunk without deciding to. Every part of him narrowed down to listening, and whatever had made the sound didn't repeat it. He counted to 60 in his head before he moved again. He'd never in his life stood so still for so long over a sound that might have been nothing. Twice more he thought he heard something ahead of him, and both times it turned out to be his own boot against loose stone, his own breath louder in his ears than it should have been. He was not, he realized somewhere in the middle of it, thinking about the Whitfields at all, or the fawn, or any of the slow accumulation of the last several weeks. He was thinking only entirely about his son, somewhere out here in the dark, and about how badly he needed the next sound he heard to be a boy and not anything else. He found Eli standing at the edge of the Whitfield property, in a small clearing near the old fence line, not moving, not making a sound. His arms hung loose at his sides, not covering his face, not doing any of the things a body does on instinct when it doesn't want to see something. His eyes were open. He wasn't blinking much. Wade's own steps slowed without him deciding to slow them, each one costing him more than the last, until the final few yards took longer to cross than the whole quarter-mile before it. It took Wade's mind a full second longer than it should have to assemble what he was looking at. Shapes on the ground that didn't resolve properly at first, wrongness before recognition, like your eyes sometimes refuse the thing they're seeing until your mind has built a container for it. Then it resolved. Harold. Vivian. What was left of them? Wade's eyes caught on one detail before his mind could turn away from the rest of it. The marks along what remained of Harold's arm, spaced and shaped in a way that had nothing coyote-sized or dog-sized about them, a bite radius too wide, too deliberate, too aimed. Eli hadn't made a sound the whole time. He wasn't hurt. He was just standing there, and when Wade got a hand on his shoulder, he came away from it easy, pliable, like a much younger kid being led out of somewhere he shouldn't have seen. Wade's own hands weren't steady, not for the first several seconds, and some distant, useless part of his mind noted that in all his years on this land, foaling seasons that went wrong, animals lost to weather and age and bad luck, he had never once stood over a thing his body wanted this badly to simply not have seen. He put that part of himself away, filed with everything else he couldn't afford yet, and turned his whole attention to the boy in front of him instead, because that was the only piece of this he could actually do something about. "Don't look back," Wade said, low, close to his ear. "I've got you. Just walk." Eli walked. He didn't say anything at all, not one word, and Wade didn't push him to, just kept one hand steady on his shoulder the whole rest of the way. Hank Pruitt's cruiser turned into the Colter driveway, not 10 minutes after the radio call had gone out. Faye's voice was thin and fast over the CB, catching Earl somewhere on the county road with Renee still in the passenger seat, both of them 20 minutes out and closing. Pruitt had gotten enough of the dispatch call before it cut to know something was badly wrong, and he came up the drive with his lights on and his window down, already calling out toward the house. "Get back in the car!" Faye was at the window, one arm braced against the frame, yelling it before he'd even fully stopped. "Hank, get back in the car!" He saw the horses then, the way they were arranged evenly around the yard instead of bunched, the fact that not one of them carried the restless weight shift of a spooked animal, and every year he'd spent on this job came up short of a category for what he was looking at. His hand went to the radio at his shoulder out of pure reflex, calling it in, though there wasn't going to be time for whatever came of that call to reach him. He'd handled livestock calls before, a bull loose on the county road, a spooked horse tangled in wire, and every one of them had followed a pattern he knew how to work with, an animal reacting to fear, wanting distance, wanting out. This wasn't that. These weren't afraid of him. They were arranged like men arranging themselves to keep someone from leaving a room, and some old, animal part of Hank Pruitt understood that fact a full 2 seconds before his training caught up and told him what to do with it. By then, it was already too late to do much of anything at all. They came toward him slow, spreading out from the fence line in a shallow half-circle that put the cruiser at its center. Not a charge, nothing like what Wade had described from the Whitfield place. This was quieter, more patient, 3 of them closing the distance in careful, unhurried steps while Pruitt's hand found the door handle of his cruiser, parked maybe 15 feet short of the porch, and stopped there, hesitating, because they weren't behaving like animals that needed to be shot. Not yet. They were behaving like something working a plan. And they were calling to each other. Low, held notes, bending in pitch, one answering another from a different point around the yard. A coordination in the sound that Faye, behind the window glass, recognized immediately as the same wrongness she'd been hearing at a distance for weeks, now close enough and loud enough that there was no explaining it as anything else. It didn't sound like horses anymore. It sounded, in the worst and most specific way, like something taking turns. Pruitt started backing toward the open door, slow, hands loose at his sides, same as he'd have backed away from any spook animal in 20 years on this job. One of them was already behind him. He half-turned, saw it there, cutting the last clean line to the car, and Faye watched his whole body change in the space of a second, the loose, professional calm gone, replaced by something much older and much more honest. Faye watched from the window. One hand pressed flat against Josie's chest to keep her from getting any closer to it, and she saw enough, motion, the specific violent economy of it, Pruitt going down and not getting back up, without ever seeing the whole of it clearly, the angle and the failing light doing what mercy the scene allowed. She could not go to him. She had 3 kids in the house and no way to reach the 4th, and she stood there with her hand still pressed against Josie's chest and watched a man she'd known 15 years die in her own front yard, and there was nothing in her, soft and kind as she'd always been her whole life, that could turn that watching into anything but watching. She had held this family together through worse than she'd ever admit to any of them, and she held it together now, in the only way left available to her, by staying exactly where she was, between her grandchildren and the window, and not making a sound that would tell whatever was out there that anyone inside was still afraid. Wren had her face pressed into Wyatt's shoulder by then, not looking. Wyatt had one arm around his sister, and the other braced flat against the doorframe, holding it shut, holding all of them in, and none of them said a word for a long time after the yard went quiet again. Wade heard them before he saw anything, a different quality of movement through the brush than horses walking, something heavier and dragged, undergrowth breaking in a rhythm that didn't match footfall alone. He got Eli down and still, off the path, into the cover of a fallen trunk, one hand flat and firm on the boy's back, and they waited while the sound passed within 30 yards of them, and did not stop, continuing on toward the pasture, toward wherever it was headed. He never saw what they were carrying. He didn't need to. The sound told him enough, and worse, it kept going, long after the herd itself would have passed out of earshot. A wet, steady, terrible sound coming from somewhere out in the dark pasture that didn't stop the whole rest of the walk home. They walked the last half-mile inside that sound, not knowing exactly how far was far enough to stop hearing it. Eli's hand found his father's at some point without either of them deciding it, and neither of them let go until the porch light was in view. Earl's truck came up the drive with its headlights cutting hard across the yard, Renee already half out of the door before it had fully stopped, and for one strange, suspended second, the whole family was converging on the same patch of ground at once. Wade and Eli coming out of the tree line, Faye and the three kids spilling from the house, Earl swinging down from the cab with something in his face that had never been there in Wade's whole life of knowing him. "Get in," Wade said. "Now, all of you." Renee had her arms around Eli for exactly 1 second, long enough to know he was breathing and whole, before her training took over and she was moving everyone with brisk, practical urgency toward the truck instead. There'd be time for the rest of it later. Now, if there was a later, the herd was already turning toward the new sound, the new lights, when Earl, without needing to be told, some old instinct in a man who'd fed this land his whole life, gunned the engine twice, hard, in the exact broken rhythm the feed truck had always come up that drive. A portion of the herd's attention broke toward the truck, toward the sound their whole learned life had told them meant something entirely different than what was actually happening. And in the half-second that bought, the family was in the truck bed and cab both, doors slamming, tires already turning. They pulled out fast, horses breaking into pursuit along the fence line, their calls rising wild and dangerous into the dark behind them, cutting hard across pasture at angles meant to intercept rather than chase. And for a quarter-mile down the county road, it was a straight, terrible race. Headlights and hoofbeats, and Faye's arms wrapped around Wren in the back seat, Wren's own hands pressed tight over her ears to shut the sound of it out. Josie pressed against the other window, watching shapes keep pace with them in the dark that no horse should have been able to keep pace with. Earl had the revolver out of the glove box already, loading it by feel in the dark cab, thumbing rounds into the cylinder with hands that hadn't shaken, doing anything else all night. The hoofbeats closed hardest on the passenger side, one set pulling ahead of the rest until it was matching the truck stride for stride, right outside Earl's window. And when he turned his head, the horse's eyes were already on him, fixed and forward, waiting for exactly that. In the back seat, Renee got her other arm around Josie and pulled her in close, closing her eyes and mouthing something silent and fast that might have been a prayer she hadn't said out loud since she was a girl. Earl's hands went still on the revolver, some old instinct freezing him for half a second, longer than anything on this ranch had managed to freeze him in 50 years. It opened its mouth and let out a cry that had no business coming from a horse's throat, teeth bared long and wrong in the dashboard light, and somewhere out in the dark behind them, the rest of the herd answered it. The same cry passed back across the pasture, like something being repeated on purpose. Wyatt grabbed a fistful of his grandfather's shirt and hauled him sideways, off the window, both of them thrown together against the console before either had time to think about it. Its head came down and slammed into the glass once, hard enough to shatter it, safety glass crazing white in a spiderweb before caving inward across Earl's lap in a shower of blunt fragments. And screaming broke out from the whole cab before anyone could stop it, Josie's voice cutting through clearest of all. "Oh my God! Oh my God! Oh my God!" over and over, like the words themselves were the only thing holding her together. "Damn it," Wade said, one arm thrown out toward Earl on pure instinct as the truck lurched, fighting the wheel one-handed with the other, holding the road by inches. "Shoot it!" Faye's voice cracked from the back seat, sharp and scared in a way none of them had heard from her before. "Earl, shoot it!" Earl snapped the cylinder shut and brought the revolver up level with the glass, and the horse peeled off before he'd even found the trigger, dropping back, falling out of the headlight's reach, gone from the window like it had never been there at all. One by one, the others fell back behind it, peeling away into the dark along the fence line until the road behind them held nothing but road, headlights and blacktop, and the ordinary dark of a county highway at night. Nobody said much of anything for a long while after that. Wade kept the truck at a hard, steady speed, putting real distance behind them, mile marker after mile marker, until the shake finally started working its way out of his own hands on the wheel. It was several miles on before headlights broke over a rise ahead of them, coming the other way, many more than one vehicle's worth, a convoy moving fast toward the ranch. And it passed them in a flash too quick to process, red and blue and unmarked white all at once, gone behind them before anyone in the truck could do more than register that it had happened. "What was that?" Eli said, to no one, to everyone, the first thing he'd said out loud since Wade found him in that clearing. Nobody answered him. Nobody had an answer yet. In the mirror, glimpsed and then gone, Wade watched the convoy's taillights shrink back toward the ranch behind them. Whatever was about to happen there no longer any part of what had just happened to his family. He kept his eyes forward, kept driving, and didn't look back again. Whatever happened behind them happened behind them. Wade didn't stop driving until they were most of an hour clear of the county line, pulled off finally at a gas station lit up too bright against the dark, and for a long moment nobody in the truck moved to get out. Renee had both arms around Eli in the back seat. Wyatt sat up front between Wade and Earl, staring straight ahead at nothing, his jaw working like he wanted to say something and couldn't find where to start. Faye still had her hand pressed flat against Josie's chest, same as it had been pressed there at the window, like she'd forgotten to take it away. Wren was crying, quietly, the kind of crying that comes a long time after the thing that caused it. Nobody spoke. Nobody had the words yet for what the last 2 hours had been, and for a while the only sound in the truck was the engine ticking as it cooled and Wren's breathing evening out, slowly, against her grandmother's shoulder. Eli sat pressed against his mother's side, eyes open, staring at nothing in particular, and none of them, not even Renee, tried yet to ask him what he'd seen. That conversation, whenever it finally happened, was going to need more than a gas station parking lot and a night this bad behind it. Wade got out, eventually, and stood by the pump doing nothing at all, not even pretending to fill the tank, just standing in the cold with his hands braced on the truck bed, looking back the way they'd come. The night was quiet out here, ordinary in a way that felt almost obscene given everything the last few hours had held. A single moth circling the gas station light like nothing in the world had changed at all. Chapter 10. The sample sent off from a dead fawn weeks earlier had finished its slow climb up a chain of laboratories neither the Colters nor anyone at that county sheriff's substation had ever heard of, and it had come back in the end with a word attached to it that made federal phones start ringing at speeds nothing in that county had ever seen before. A prion strain unlike any on record, already loose in wildlife, already crossing species. The response that arrived was not, in the end, for the Colters. It was for what the Colters' land represented, a live, active, spreading thing that could not be allowed to keep spreading. The property was condemned within the week. The herd was destroyed as part of containment. Every animal on it, along with a wide perimeter of surrounding land, nobody was permitted to set foot on again. The family lost the ranch. Every acre of it, the house, the barn, the backfield that had sat closed off since before Earl was born, and had, in the end, taken almost everything from them anyway. They were given one supervised morning to gather what they could carry. A federal escort standing at the property line the whole time, masked, watching a clock none of the Colters could see. Renee packed kitchen things without really looking at them, moving on instinct. Josie went straight to the tack room and came out with a single halter, Ranger's, worn soft at the buckle from years of use, and nothing else from that room, because carrying more of it out the door wasn't something she could make herself do. Wren took her external hard drive and left the camera itself behind, which she'd think about later as the strangest decision of that whole morning, that in the end it was never really about the equipment. Earl stood a long moment at the edge of the drive looking back toward the closed-off field past the house, the one that had sat unused his entire life for reasons he'd never once been given, and said nothing to anyone about what he was looking at or why. Faye took his arm, and after a while he let himself be walked to the truck. Wade was the last one off the property. He stood at the gate he'd opened himself, months back, in a drought that felt now like it belonged to some other, much simpler year, and pulled it shut behind him out of nothing but old habit. There was no herd left to keep in, no reason left to close a gate at all, and got in the truck without looking back a second time. They moved into the city that fall. It was a smaller house than any of them were used to, with no pasture out the back window, no fence line to check in the morning, no herd to feed. Renee found the same kind of hospital in a bigger city and picked up nearly the same shifts. Wyatt went back to school. Josie found, eventually, a stable an hour out that let her ride on weekends, though it took months of sitting across from a therapist twice a week before she could bring herself to get back on a horse at all. And even then, she didn't talk much about how it compared. Eli got a new camera for his birthday, a regular one this time, no motion sensor, and started photographing things in the city instead. Pigeons, mostly, and the specific gray light that came off the buildings in the evening. And once, memorably, a fox that had no business being 3 blocks from a subway stop, which earned him a full 10 minutes of his father's genuine attention at breakfast, same as it always had. Earl was quieter in the city than he'd ever been on the ranch, which was saying something, and Faye took to keeping a small garden box on the balcony, 3 pots of something green, because a person needed something growing near them, she said, wherever they ended up. Josie kept a single photograph of Ranger on her nightstand, the only one she'd taken time to grab on the way out that last night, and never bought a frame for any of the others still sitting on her phone, scrolling past them some nights and never quite opening one all the way. Nobody talked much about the backfield, or what had been buried near it 70 years before any of them were born, or the 2 fragments Earl still carried and had never once managed to put into a whole story for anyone. Some things didn't need telling to be carried. It was not the ending any of them would have chosen. It was, all the same, the only one they got to walk away from. And on the nights it was hardest to sleep, Wade found that was usually enough to hold on to until morning. Some Sundays, out of habit more than anything, the whole family still ended up in the same small kitchen at the same time, no fence to check, no herd to feed, the day accomplishing nothing in particular. Renee still made the pancakes. They still came out looking like nothing in particular, animal-shaped only in the sense that most things with 4 points could be called animal-shaped if you squinted, and Josie still told her so, and Renee still called her Josephine, and for the length of one breakfast, most weeks that was enough. Epilogue. The land didn't know it had been condemned. Land doesn't know anything. That was always the trouble with looking to it for answers, the mistake every generation of Colters had made in their turn, filling its silences with whatever meaning suited them at the time. It had held the spring long before anyone fenced it off, and it would go on holding it long after the fences came down, rusting where they stood because nobody left was allowed to touch them. By the second spring, the grass had come back thick over the old backfield, thicker than it had grown in living memory, feeding on whatever was still down there doing the slow work it had always done. Deer came through some evenings, the way deer always had, drifting along the same tree line that used to mark the Whitfield property, dropping their heads to drink from water nobody tested anymore. Some of them had fawns that year. Not all of the fawns lived. No one was there to notice, and the land, if it noticed anything at all, kept it to itself the way it always had, patient and unbothered and in absolutely no hurry to be finished. 1958. By August, 6 horses on the Colter ranch had stopped eating right. It started with one gelding going off his feed for 2 days running, then coming back to it like nothing had happened. Within weeks, 5 more were doing the same, along with something new, stumbling on flat ground, standing too long in one place, drool hanging off their mouths in ropes that hadn't been there before. Nobody called a vet from outside the county. There wasn't one who'd have known what he was looking at. Not in 1958. Not for something like this. Robert Colter watched and waited and told himself there was still time to keep watching and waiting a while longer. There wasn't. On what would have been a rather ordinary afternoon in August, young Earl Colter drifted out past the main post line, past where he'd been told to stay, chasing nothing in particular, doing what any 8-year-old does when nobody's watching close. Louise Colter's head turned away for only a moment, back toward the house, and when it turned back, A horse had already closed the distance to her son that no horse had any business closing. Behind it, a gate that should have been locked swayed gently back and forth on its hinge, like nobody had thought to notice it hanging open at all. She was off the porch and running before she'd even finished deciding to, and had Earl scooped up and clutched hard against her chest by the time the horse caught up to them, stopping square in front of her. Its face was wrong in ways she couldn't yet put a name to. Longer through the jaw than any horse had a right to be, both eyes pulled forward off the sides of its skull and fixed dead on her instead of turned out wide to either side where a horse's eyes belonged. Its lips had drawn back off teeth too long and too straight-edged for grazing, built for something else entirely, and every breath it took came slow and deliberate and audible, a controlled rasp, nothing panicked in it anywhere. She held perfectly still, Earl's whole weight locked against her, and for one endless moment neither of them moved at all. Then a shotgun blast tore through the afternoon, and the horse didn't so much as flinch at the sound of it. No ear pinning, no bolt, no scramble like any properly spooked animal would have managed. It stared at her a moment longer, unmoving, letting the silence stretch past the point where an ordinary animal would have looked away or lost interest. Off along the fence line, a handful of others had gathered without her ever noticing them arrive, and they opened their throats together in a sound with no business coming from anything on four legs, high and looping and strange, the kind of sound that got down into a person's teeth and stayed there. Then the tension went out of its face all at once, sudden as a held breath finally let go, and it turned, slow and unhurried, and trotted back through the open gate to join the others, like none of it had happened. Robert reached them at a dead run only a few seconds later, the shotgun still smoking in one hand, and got the gate shut and latched before he'd so much as looked at either of them properly. The moment it locked, Louise's legs gave out from under her, and she went down into the dirt with Earl still held tight against her chest, sharp, ragged breaths tearing in and out of her like she couldn't pull in enough air no matter how hard she tried. "Robert," she managed, the word coming out thin and cracked. "Robert." He was down in front of her before the second one had finished leaving her mouth, one hand cupped hard against the side of her face, checking Earl over with the other, saying her name over and over until she finally looked at him and not at the tree line. He'd seen the horse itself from a good 30 yards off, close enough to put a shot in the air and not much else. It was Louise who'd been close enough to see the rest of it, and she told him everything she could that same afternoon, out on the porch, with the door shut so Earl wouldn't have to hear it twice. What she'd seen in its face, she never quite managed to put into words that satisfied even herself, and it didn't much matter in the end, whether he believed all of it or just enough of it. Nobody sat Earl down and explained any of it to him directly. He was 8, and 8-year-olds get sent to bed early on nights when the grown-ups need the kitchen table to themselves, and he was left instead with a single image that never quite let go of him. A horse standing very still at the fence line, watching them go, both eyes fixed dead on his, and then the cry that came out of it, a sound that didn't belong anywhere near a horse's throat, one that found every nerve he had and never quite let go of them either. The decision came that night, though Robert never got the chance to make it himself before it was made for him. The handler showed up an hour later, right on his usual scheduled visit, with no idea anything on the property had changed since the last one. Robert met him at the truck and had a talk with him first, laying it out plain, the feed, the drooling, the stumbling, and now a horse that had gone after his own boy in broad daylight that same afternoon. The handler wouldn't hear it, not really. He'd known most of these horses since they were foals, had a closeness with them. Robert had never quite managed himself, and something in his face said he'd already decided Robert had to be wrong about at least part of it. He insisted on seeing them for himself before he'd agree to anything. Robert went with him, the shotgun broken open over one arm, telling himself the whole walk out that he was only bringing it because a careful man carried a gun around sick stock, not because he believed what his own eyes had already told him twice that day. Neither of them got the chance to be careful about anything. The horse came off the fence line faster than 1,500 pounds of anything had any right to move, and the handler's arm was gone at the shoulder in something close to a single second. By the time Robert had the shotgun anywhere near level, the whole herd was already running for the tree line together, all 6 of them, gone in a few seconds and leaving a long, dark trail through the grass behind them that Robert didn't let himself look at too closely until morning. The handler didn't make it to dusk. The arm itself was never found, not that night and not after. 6 ranchers came out that same night with rifles and tracked them into the trees by lantern light, most of it gone before they'd run all 6 of them down. Afterward, they dragged the bodies out to the low end of the back field, near the spring that kept that one corner greener than the rest of the property, and buried them there, in ground nobody planned on digging up again. Robert closed the gate on that field before he ever washed the blood off his hands. Nobody in the family used it again for 70 years.